Yeah, I think we are good to start. So, hello everyone, and welcome for our second session of the Respect and Shame in Healthcare and Bioethics workshop series. So, this is jointly organized by myself. I'm Supriya Subramani. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Biomedical Ethics and History of Medicine at University of Zurich. And Professor Luna Dolzel, unfortunately, she couldn't make it for today. She's an associate professor in philosophy and medical humanities, and it is funded by Wellcome Trust Shame and Medicine Project. So in this workshop series, what we were aiming is to critically engage with conceptual and phenomenological understandings of respect, disrespect, shame, and humiliations, and of course, related concepts. So by bringing together scholars from different disciplines and frameworks, we hope to enhance our understanding of both respect and shame for optimal delivery of healthcare, as well as bring rich insights to the larger bioethics debates. So before going to Vanya, just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. The workshop will be recorded and a copy of it will be available afterwards on the Shame and Medicine Project website. The format of this session is first the speaker will give the presentation for 40 minutes, and then there'll be followed by discussion for 20 minutes. And there will be a 10 minutes break. And then we have a second speaker, which again goes for 30 to 40 minutes. And then the feedback by the discussant. And then we have an open discussion. So, and then if you have any questions, please use the chat box or use the raise hand option, of course. Also, you can either type the question, I will read it out aloud, or just type the capital Q. I will call the person's name and you can unmute and just ask the question yourself. And on the final note, we are also happy that there will be a special section in the Journal for Evaluation of Clinical Practice arising from this workshop series on the theme Respect and Shame. We have opened the call for submissions. So if you're working around these concepts, we look forward to your submissions. So to shortly introduce Vania, Vania Smith-Oka is a cultural and medical anthropologist who specializes on the effect of institutions on the behavior and choice of marginalized populations, especially women. She has explored the impact of an economic development program on the reproductive lives and motherhood of indigenous women in Huasteca region of Mexico. From this research emerged her first book, Shaping the Motherhood of Indigenous Mexico. She also researched the doctor-patient relationship in maternity ward in the city of Puebla, particularly the role of space, place, and notions of social and medical risk and quality of care. So she recently completed a book project, Becoming Gods. That's fascinating book title, Medical Training in Mexican Obstetric Wards, on skills and practices and attitudes of medicine are transmitted to medical students. So today she will focus on how microaggressions in the interactions between biomedical personnel and marginalized patients potentially contributes to the discriminatory local social world and questions the efforts for universal health rights, which do not address the larger socioeconomic and inequities. Now, quite excited to listen to her more. So over to you, Vanya.
Thank you, Supriya. I really appreciate being here and for the invitation to participate and engage with all of you. So I'll share my screen and then I'll proceed. Okay. So everyone can see the screen? Yeah, okay, perfect. So like Supriya said, I'm a medical anthropologist. I'm just gonna, give a little bit of an introduction to what that might mean, and then I'll talk about my data, my research, and I look forward to a good discussion. So over the past decade or so, I've worked on ethnographic projects where I've explored the interaction between obstetric patients and their medical caregivers, as well as the effect of broader health systems on the provision of medical care. So most of my work has taken place in Mexico, but I have more recent projects taking place in Kenya and in the US as well. So I'm based in the US. I'm at the University of Notre Dame here in central US. So I've taken a very critical approach to medical care in most of my earlier work, focusing on patients' stories and their experiences. But most recently, I have been focusing more on trying to figure out the perspectives of the medical providers, especially doctors, to try to understand why they often disrespect and shame their patients, as well as why sometimes this disrespect is enacted bodily as forms of obstetric violence. I want to add the caveat that because I'm an anthropologist and not a bioethicist or philosopher, I come at these questions with ethnographic data and might not be as familiar with all of the philosophical concepts that some of the other participants or audience members might have. So how does humiliation within the obstetric encounter arise? And what is the nature of this behavior and what consequences does it have for patient well-being? So today I will focus on how humiliation is present in the interactions between biomedical personnel and the marginalized obstetrics patients potentially contribute to a discriminatory local social world. So despite medical tenets and hospital guidelines that delineate respect and value towards the autonomy of patients, there's real life frictions between clinicians and patients who they consider to be problematic others that result in both shaming and obstetric violence within these clinical encounters. So within such situations, we find jokes and microaggressions that result in humiliation. And these are comments or jokes aimed at denigrating the suitability for motherhood of certain obstetric patients, as well as to shame them, so which is what I would describe as a more sort of deeper moralized version of modern motherhood, which is then inscribed on patients' bodies. So I will start with some definitions of the terms I will be using today that might not be familiar to everyone in the audience. So obstetric violence is defined as problematic care in childbirth, including medicalized, abusive, careless, non-consented, or negligent care that results in the loss of autonomy and reproductive rights. And it's usually brought about by power dynamics between laboring women and their medical caregivers. And this is ultimately structured by a combination of institutional, structural, or symbolic violence, or I should say, and/or symbolic violence, as all three of them could be, interacting together. Patient blaming and shaming, as well as the normalization of abuse, can be additional consequences or parts of this violence. Combined with racism, it becomes obstetric racism, which affects women of color in disproportionately violent ways and leads to what has been termed stratified reproduction, which is the presence of persistent historical patterns of social inequality based on things such as class or color, gender, caste, etc., that value the reproduction of some populations over others. And then this reinforces social hierarchies. So what I will attempt to show today is that violence towards laboring women can take many forms, including the verbal interactions with patients, which as I will describe here, can include humiliating and shaming language. Finally, microaggressions are defined as subtle and demeaning behavior, typically aimed at people of color or to problematic others, that reflect and reinforce the perpetrators' perceptions of their own superiority. So microaggressions can be damaging to the recipients, exacerbating existing structures and hierarchies. And jokes can be a part of these microaggressions, as their potential to shame can uncover the workings of power. So humor exists at the margins and allows one to examine the spaces between expectations and reality. And some jokes can reflect what Supriya's work, where she refers to as micro-inequities, which she defines as minute expressions and events that may or may not be recognized by the victims and perpetrators, while others might be quite overt, uttered deliberately by the perpetrators and felt explicitly as shameful by the victims. So jokes in medical spaces can take various forms. These can be jokes made to patients, jokes made about them to clinicians, and these can take place front stage or backstage. Jokes can also be made publicly to a group, or jokes can be made privately in more intimate conversations. And these jokes show the complexity and nuance of humorous interactions, in particular how some of these interactions are difficult to actually classify as jokes, even though laughter might be part of the event. So humor is a very complex performance, and it's marked by shifting alliances, by audiences, workings of workings of power, gender dynamics, as well as hierarchies. And I'll unpack some of these today. So in my talk today, I draw from research on shame and humiliation, for instance, work by Dolezal and Lyons, that states that emotional or affective states like shame can have significant impacts on health, on illness, and health-related behaviors. As Luna Dolezal stated in her talk a few weeks ago, shame is a negative emotion that arises when some part of oneself is seen by others and judged to be flawed or inadequate, inappropriate, or immoral in some way. So Dolezal and Lyons describe a shame as a self-conscious emotion because the object of shame is oneself and elicits one's discomfort with how other people view that actual self. So shame focuses on the perceived inherent parts of the person, considering the person to be flawed in some way. And thus, people who are forced to feel shame will feel highly visible and thus try to conceal that shameful thing, whatever that is, in some way. Irving Goffman stated in The Stigmatized Self that people who don't fit can often be intimately alive to what others see as their failing. And so they inevitably internalize this feeling of falling short of where they ought to be. He argued that shame arises from a person's perception that they're defiled in some way. And this defilement could mean either either possessing problematic attributes or not possessing desirable ones. Thus, shame is isolating. It can sever social bonds and can make one feel unaccepted by others. So people will studiously avoid shame. Contexts such as the one I will describe today are structured in such a way that patients cannot avoid the shame. They're separated from their kin, their social support, as well as their objects of identity, such as their clothes, their identity papers, etc. And so they can be humiliated and shamed and have no recourse to counter it. So I'm going to use examples from my research in hospitals in Mexico to showcase some of my arguments about obstetric violence, microaggressions, jokes, shame, and bioethics. As in many countries in the global south, one of the central concerns of Mexico's development agenda is providing wider access to healthcare in an attempt to close the economic and social gap between its most affluent as well as its most poorest citizens. Yet access to care does not guarantee compassionate care. And so medical interactions between middle-class clinicians, who could be physicians or nurses, as well as their impoverished patients, reveal not only a lack of empathy, but also acts of shame and violence by clinicians towards the patients under their care. So just a bit of context to those unfamiliar with Mexico. Mexico is a middle-income country marked by tremendous historical and current disparities across various axes, which could be class, ethnicity and skin color, gender, location where one comes from, such as being urban or rural, etc., or indigeneity, so language spoken, etc. The intersection of these social categories has created systems of marked discrimination and disadvantage for certain populations. For example, to be female, impoverished, dark-skinned, or rural, compared to simultaneously privileging other social categories, such as male, or white, or light-skinned, or urban. So these racial, gendered, and class dynamics are historically traced and reproduced, and seem to be especially visible in maternity spaces. As others have argued, empathic processes do not unfold in a political or moral vacuum. Indeed, the historical circumstances of stratification in Mexico have predisposed middle-class physicians to a lack of empathy towards the poor, as well as a perception of radical otherness. So this sort of marked social distinction between patients and their clinicians that exacerbates the interactions between these groups. So over more than a decade, I've carried out ethnographic research in the city of Puebla, which is the fourth largest city in Mexico. And I'll just go back to the previous slide where you can see the little arrow up here. And Puebla is in central Mexico, a couple of hours from Mexico City. So it's the fourth largest city. It is densely populated. It's very urban, very industrial, very wealthy in many ways. It has a lot of industry, lots of car industries like Audi and BMW and VW have plants there. It's an old city. It's got beautiful colonial buildings like the one you see here. But there's also, a tremendous amount of economic, social disparity. So, for instance, some of the very small statistics I've included here, it has a poverty rate of about almost 34%. and of which 6% live in extreme poverty, which means, you know, any sort of health situation, as minor as it might be, could be considered a catastrophic health situation, because they would send them into financial ruin. So, you know, this is a third of the population living in some degree of poverty, and a sizable proportion also living in extreme poverty. So I have done what's called hospital ethnography in several hospitals in the city, including a large public maternity hospital, where most of the data for today come from. As well as I also did research more recently at a large public hospital that had a small maternity unit. So, you know, just sort of trying to compare different spaces. And another more recent one is a small private hospital. And so just trying to examine the various ways by which healthcare is provided in public hospitals, in private hospitals, and the sort of distinctions of patient care, which I'm not going to go into too much today in terms of these differences of public and private, but I'm happy to talk about them. And, you know, more recent work of mine does examine this contrast as well. So most of the physicians I interviewed expressed what seemed to be genuine concern for the health and well-being of their patients. And they expressed this concern in terms of sort of blaming patients, right? They were talking about the patients needed to have more self-care, they needed to have more responsibility for their health. And so they tended to see their patients as deficient in some way. So every clinician I spoke with shared their candid opinions about their patients and what they saw as their inability to fully care for them because of what they saw to be intractable social problems. So they overwhelmingly considered their patients to be problematic, non-compliant, immature, and that was either in age or reason, or unable to control themselves, whether sexually or during labor and delivery. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they were additionally frustrated by issues of scarcity, you know, scarcity of supplies and time and resources, which was equally matched by the number of patients. So they considered to, you know, have a scarcity of everything except patients, of which there was a surfeit. So physicians regularly used what I'm calling here shaming humor to vent their frustrations with the mundane and routine interactions with patients, which they also aimed to try to modify their patients' behavior. So while some studies have argued that humor is a necessary venting mechanism, what I saw was a darker side of the humor, which often revealed the underlying assumptions and stereotypes of class, disparities between clinicians and their patients. So much like Supriya's work in India, the doctors in the wards in Mexico used implicit bias and stereotypes to categorize their patients, where they linked certain traits, such as gender or class or educational or marital status of their patients, with perceived behaviors and morals, such as being overly sexual, irresponsible, dishonest, etc. So these stereotypes ultimately categorized patients based on certain worthiness qualities, which is what Supriya mentions in her work. So as I will describe, much of the humor seemed to be aimed at correcting quote unquote problem mothers, humiliating and shaming them about their social and sexual lives. So clinicians' frustrations with their patients and their working conditions were expressed in multiple forms, including outward anger at patients, impatient treatment, irritated comments, shaming and joking, or dismissive laughter. So majority of the humor and shaming revolved around the suitability of the patients to be mothers. Several physicians had a joking and teasing relationship with their patients, which was one-sided, I should note here. So the interactions of one male physician illustrate how these frustrations and underlying assumptions were often expressed in shaming mechanisms. Although he seemed to enjoy his work, he would often, for instance, smile and joke with staff and patients. He was often quite aggressive in his management of birth and generally unconcerned about the pain experienced by his patients. So I'm not talking about that work here, but he was in the habit of like aggressively dilating women before birth, which he would do it manually with his fingers, and the women would be screaming in pain, right? So that's the sort of obstetrically violent part of that. What I'm talking about here is more these sort of subtle interactions that he would have with patients, where he was really shaming them to sort of just sort of call out things that he saw as problematic. So the interaction I'm describing here, he was examining an 18-year-old woman who was experiencing her first pregnancy. And, she'd come into the emergency room, labor room, thinking that, because she had cramps and wasn't feeling too well. So she thought, maybe she was in labor. She was particularly nervous about everything. And, she was young. And so, the doctor kind of zeroed in on that particular element of her identity. So, he was interacting with her, talking about different things, and then he immediately sort of said that, she was saying she was tired. Pregnancy, by the end of the pregnancy, carrying a heavy load there, she was kind of tired. So he was joking about her fatigue, and saying that, she needed to get used to the lack of sleep, because, like the quote says here, because you'll never sleep when the baby comes. You will get up at all times to check on it. And if you're fodonga, which is a Mexican term that means sort of slovenly and lazy, you'll just ignore it. There was then a conversation about how many weeks pregnant she was. So he started to calculate them. She, for some reason, thought she was 43 weeks pregnant, which, would be highly unlikely, given that the sort of the usual length of pregnancy is 40 weeks. But, he then did his calculation, and he thought that she was probably 38 and a half weeks. And so he turned to her and says, "You see how you lie then?" And then immediately asked her, "Are you easy?" And she blushed, and with a slight stutter, which showed her confusion about the question, she answered that she'd been with her boyfriend for 2.5 years. So continuing to tease her, he said, "You see, you're not that easy. You did not get pregnant. Maybe you didn't know how to get pregnant." So she replied, kind of upset, right? She said, "Yes, I did." And so at the end of this exchange, he winks at me and the female nurse and a female intern in the room, who were the audience of his little joke. And he said cheekily, I'm the worst." So what we can see here is that the physician shamed the patient by drawing on stereotypes about the type of patient that they were seeing there. And he made comments that had the effect of framing the patient in a negative moral light. So her exhaustion after the baby's birth, the laziness in caregiving, deceitfulness, sexual proclivities, and ignorance about reproduction. So in this small exchange, right, we've got so much sort of laden in there. In addition, his performance of, quote, being the worst established an alliance between himself and his audience, which were myself and the medical staff, while simultaneously othering the patient as the object of ridicule and shame. So despite the seeming good-naturedness of the interactions with the young woman, his attitude suggests an intentional lack of empathy, anchored by gender and class privilege. So he used shaming words because he could, reinforcing the power dynamics in this clinical setting. So teasing is a form of intentional provocation that makes a negative statement about the recipient, which is then framed as humor. So the young woman's response to that teasing, she was uncertain because she was uncertain how to respond to it, right? Because its apparent intent is to be playful, and so the recipient might believe the utterances to be true, and so thus feel ashamed of these comments. Thus, when the physician responded to the when the patient responded to the physician's questions and assertions with anger and confusion, the physician considered the interaction even funnier, her response and affirmation that his shaming had been successful. Although the physician signaled that he was teasing through a disclaimer, like, "I'm the worst," also with a lighthearted tone and winking, his supposedly innocent behavior reflects a more problematic moral habitus and class and gender-based stereotypes, as he shamed a vulnerable, unmarried, low-income young woman who, in his eyes, and those of the hospital, was in need of learning appropriate behavior. So the physician's shaming revealed racialized and class-based stereotypes of his patient as lazy, as deceitful, sexually loose, and disorderly. As others have observed, teasing can occur when social norms have been violated and is intended to shame the recipient. In this case, the physician shamed the unmarried pregnant teenager by pointing out her faults with respect to what society expected from motherhood, and therefore also highlighting the social chasm between him and his patient. So the physician's assumptions that the young patient would be lazy with her childcare, easy with her sexuality, deceitful about her life, or ignorant about reproduction were more than just offhand comments, instead fitting squarely within class-based ideas of the motherhood of impoverished, and in this case also adolescent mothers. Most of these interactions reflect a historical legal framework which continues to structure a sense of inevitability that has created impunity for gender violence. So such indictments of women by society demonstrate what Charlotte Haney has described as imperiled femininity, which results from assessments of a woman's moral condition. As the anthropologist Radcliffe Brown pointed out several decades ago, many joking relationships are asymmetrical, where one person is allowed to mock the other and the recipient is not allowed to take offense. So the jokes in these clinical settings were clearly asymmetrical from clinicians to patients. And as in other medical settings, the historical context of status and power profoundly shape the way that these medical interactions take place. The particular class and ethnic history of Mexico has created a distinct social distance between different groups that is mirrored by the humiliation and shaming present in these encounters. So the physician's assumptions reflect the almost insurmountable social divide between both parties. He could make these shaming comments with impunity because he was a physician, he was educated, and he was male. And he was also one of the few attending obstetricians at that hospital. And so he was in charge of the patient's prenatal care and possibly her eventual birth. As such, he wielded great power over his patients' birthing experiences, and patients would rarely be able to seek out alternative care to avoid his shaming behavior. So such comments traveling down the social structure, wherein inequalities of status already created tensions, can reinforce and broaden the fissures between both groups. His use of humiliating and shaming language emphasized the division between physician and patient, the powerful and the powerless, us and them. Perhaps because of the supposed benign nature of the teasing, the patient was unable to retort in any effective way apart from confusion, as any anger exhibited would simply fuel the laughter. So this inability to counter would feed back into the disempowerment felt by patients in these contexts. Another prevailing assumption about the patients was their unrestrained sexuality and hyperfertility. So almost universally, the clinicians considered their patients very promiscuous. One female attending physician's words particularly demonstrate the class-based assumptions and general impressions of the patients as multiparous, with poor hygiene and probably only having received one prenatal visit. Sometimes there are many older ones with low socioeconomic status from rural communities. Those are the typical ones. They have infections, use no family planning, have little hygiene. There's a lot of promiscuity in the ranchitos, the little villages. So ranchitos is a diminutive version of rancho, which is a rural village. But it does not simply indicate a location, it's actually also impregnated with meaning related to skin color and degree of indigenous heritage. So using these classist and racist perspectives to classify the patients, the physician alluded to the prevailing dichotomy between rural and urban, poor and rich, unhygienic and hygienic, uneducated and educated, them and us, with the purpose of underscoring the hypersexuality of racialized others. These class-inflected and gendered ideologies are also evident in the implied dichotomy between pure women and fallen women, wherein women are expected to conform to expectations of female virtue so as not to fall in the category of what Haney terms the body cualquiera, the body nobody, the fallen body. So the supposedly hypersexual behavior and lack of contraception and adequate mothering skills among low-income and brown-skinned patients were viewed by clinicians as a reproductive threat to Mexican society. It can also be considered as gendered shame, which Chabot and Carême define as something experienced by women when they fail to, quote, construct themselves as good mothers and good women and fit mothers. So physicians also used crude mentions of sex to simultaneously humiliate and shame their patients. So a few days after giving birth, one patient recounted her experience of a clinician's perception of her hypersexuality. She said while she was waiting in the emergency room, a female physician came out and harangued the other laboring patients, jeering at the women in pain. Now you may scream in pain, but 9 months ago you were screaming in pleasure. This language was used to shame the sexual lives of patients. And the patient was obviously upset and said to me later, well, what does she care? A baby should be made with love, not pain or violation. And I should add that these kind of comments of, now you may scream in pain, but 9 months you were screaming in pleasure has been found by almost every researcher working in these spaces across the world. It is not just, one sort of anecdotal example. And it's incredibly, it's almost the same verbiage, right? There's something really powerful about that, which I'm not going to delve into today, but, a whole book could probably be written about this quote itself and, all the sort of the imagery and symbolism behind it. So clinicians considered the patient to be irresponsible reproducers and problematic mothers who constituted a burden to the state and also contributed nothing to society. So as one female physician complained when she heard that I was an anthropologist researching low-income women's reproductive choices, like the moment I met her, this was her first sentences to me. Oh, won't you find out why they don't use contraceptives here? It's just that these women don't know. One explains and teaches them and nothing. I think their IQ is very low because they always have children. They're such poor marginalized populations and they have tons of children. They don't understand. So the comments by physicians and nurses revealed an underlying aggression against women, low-income populations, and seemingly over-sexualized populations. This rhetoric also expressed moral judgments about sexuality, pregnancy, and normative obstetric patienthood that reflected physicians' entitlement to judge, to shame, and to regulate women's reproductive and sexual choices. Though the comment from the physician judging her patients' sexuality might have emerged from frustration with the number of laboring patients, the fact that, like I've already said, it has been recorded in many other contexts and sources by researchers across the world suggests that it is a shaming mechanism aimed at a specific type of patient. These shaming mechanisms become part of what Supriya Subramani refers to as the moral habitus, which sustains, quote, asymmetrical interactions and moral attitudes towards patients, ultimately legitimizing the moral authority of healthcare professionals to be authoritative and paternalistic. So laboring patients are in a vulnerable situation. Caught up in their labors, they're powerless against clinicians. Though one would expect a, quote, normal birth to unfold with a woman making some noise, especially when feeling the contractions or pushing the baby out, the definition of good patients in these spaces was quite constrained, right? It was a very sort of narrow definition of what a good patient is, and it was also quite enlightening. The general definition of good patients was someone who, as one nurse told me, should be very clear about why she is here. For that, and because childbirth is very painful, she should not shout, she should keep calm, and should only make the necessary effort and follow the instructions. By this standard, of course, most women's birth anywhere in the world would fall outside of good patient. But this definition was especially damaging to the patients I'm describing here, as it emphasized cooperation and compliance, reflecting middle-class standards of what constitutes good order and respectable behavior. So the trope of cooperation did not mean acting together for mutual benefit, which would imply some sort of equality or common purpose. It was actually about following orders and was code for compliance. So cooperation and compliance actually ended up being a similar, they meant the same thing. And it was compliance with medical orders in order to make the process easier for clinicians. So one female physician said that patients do not cooperate. And we explain to them, but they're subject to more complications because they don't cooperate. They don't follow indications for the examinations. So these beliefs about women's cooperation or lack thereof are emblematic of gendered shame, which, as I have here quotes from Chabot and Carême, it's a pervasive emotion that can affect women to their very core. It can be paralyzing, making women's most intimate embodied selves insecure. So gendered shame leads to obstetric violence, as it is confining, restricting, and diminishing to laboring women. It is pervasive, emerging from efforts to discipline female bodies in labor. So during labor, a patient is highly visible, and the clinical gaze transforms women's laboring bodies into dirty, overly sexual, not feminine enough, dysfunctional bodies, and focuses on women as mothers to be detached from their non-mother identity, where cooperation, compliance, and sacrifice for their baby are paramount. So good patients were those who behaved according to these standards, both inside the ward by being compliant and outside by controlling their sexuality. So shame was used to force women to comply with these standards or to mark those who did not comply. And so this is what Chabot and Carême called doubled shame. That is, on the one hand, you have laboring women who are the objects of a medical gaze. And so they're unclothed, they're exposed, they're really, sort of at everyone's view. So that becomes shameful. But on the other hand, they seem to not perform the right kind of femininity as women who would be silent or cooperative and not overly sexual. So the hospital constructed a medical space where the normative behavior for patients was modeled after a modern and middle-class notion of motherhood. Because most patients in public hospitals did not meet this expectation, their behavior became highly visible and under constant surveillance, even to the points of threats of violence. What was clearly evident in these clinical settings was the asymmetrical relationship between middle-class physicians and low-income female patients. In most of these encounters, the patients had no choice but to accept the humiliating comments leveled at them and endure the subsequent procedures that reflected and replicated the dominant structures within Mexican society. So when a patient seemed to be ignoring clinicians' orders, or she acted in unexpected ways, she was typically perceived as non-cooperative and non-compliant. This perception often seemed to justify not only verbal reprimands, but also rough physical treatment and interventions that may have had some medical justification, but that to an outsider or a patient appeared very much like punishment. So these acts of shaming differ from the gender violence that other scholars have observed in obstetric practice. So obstetric violence is rooted within a medical habitus where deep-seated notions of medical hierarchy, of status, and gender collude to exert violence upon obstetric patients. So it is violent and not merely medicalized, and is a form of gendered violence that emerges from a substrate that moralizes motherhood, usually accompanied by other microaggressions, such as humiliation and shaming. So Chabot and Carême call gendered shame one of obstetric violence's most important mechanisms. And I've got a long quote from them here, where they state that attempting to feminize women's bodies, obstetric violence makes continual use of gendered shame as a violent instrument with which to denigrate women for losing femininity or being too sexual or messy. And is performed and perpetuated by shaming women for being bad mothers to be and for acting against the myth of altruistic, self-sacrificing motherhood. Gendered shame thus serves obstetric violence twice. First, violence from the medical staff encounters less resistance and is more easily performed if the woman feels ashamed. And then second, the shaming appears to be a significant part of the violence itself. So it's got this sort of duality within these encounters, right? By shaming a woman like the ones I've described, you can, make them feel ashamed. And so it's easier to control them if they're feeling powerless and ashamed for something inherent, right? And that's the nature of shame. It is, as has been noted by others, shame is so different from guilt. Guilt is about the act, shame is about the person. And so by using shame to sort of diminish women, then they're easier to control and then the violence itself is connected to shame itself. So because of the intersections of race or skin color, of gender and class, or caste in other places, issues such as obstetric violence and racialized care can have profound effects on maternal and child health and well-being. Some of these obstetrically violent practices include unnecessary cesareans, routine episiotomies, which is the cutting of the perineum of the vaginal entrance, or the overuse of pelvic exams by different doctors or clinicians to check for dilation, but which might have the ultimate function of teaching trainees, as opposed to it actually being a function for the woman's birth itself. It's more about, oh, this is how you check for dilation, right? So you've got this sort of unnecessary element within obstetric violence, which of course then ultimately gets to the bioethical question of how the bodies of certain patients can be readily used for training purposes without their true consent. So while I don't have the opportunity to get into that much detail about this topic here right now, I'm happy to discuss this during the question and answer session if anyone wants. So the shaming or sarcastic attitude from the clinicians is not unique to this field site. It is instead a manifestation of the medical authority that has been recognized by various scholars and researchers across the world. Almost all the patients in public hospitals were considered problematic in terms of age, behavior, number of children, marital status, or sexuality. And they were considered this way by their clinicians, who saw them as transgressing social and moral norms. So shaming behavior seems to emerge as a way to make visible these problems, overtly and explicitly reminding patients of their flaws, quote unquote flaws. The type of shame that seemed to, oh, sorry, wrong page, not button. The type of shame that seemed to be prevalent in these interactions I have described is an acute form of shame. So these moments of shame produce discomfort. They change a person's interactions with others, and also, as Dolezal and Lyons have pointed out, they diminish one's sense of social worth, whether fleetingly or permanently. As I have noted elsewhere in a work that I've co-written with my colleagues Lydia Dixon and Sarah Rubin, where in this work we examine how women expect, experience, and avoid obstetric violence, women might go to great lengths to avoid experiencing a shameful experience again. So in some cases, they might avoid the hospital or clinic where they have been shamed before. Other times they might seek out alternative forms of birth care. So they might go to a midwife or birth at home. They might have different forms of resisting this, or they might refuse care altogether to avoid any potential shameful exposure. So even if any of these options could have potential detrimental effects on their health. So of course, not all women have these options. And so avoiding shame might not be possible. And so figuring out ways to cope with it can be a part of their experience as well. Though one might argue that some of the issues I have described could be solved with an improved medical care system, which I don't disagree with. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. At the core of these shaming interactions is a historical structure that implicitly and sometimes explicitly stratifies populations into worthy and unworthy of dignity and respect. So the humor used by the doctors had the effect, if not always the intention, to shame the recipients. This type of thinly veiled shaming humor provides the context to understand how jokes are entangled and embedded in daily structurings of class, ethnicity, gender, and violence, and work towards revealing these structures. So the doctors used racist and class-based stereotypes to make visible through shaming what they saw as the laziness and vagrancy of impoverished mothers and their innate oversexuality. By shaming the women, the doctors also elevated their own moral superiority. Freud, a long time ago, stated that seemingly hostile humor is cathartic, allowing people to utter what society would not let us utter aloud or consciously. However, humor allows physicians to resist blame if things go wrong, especially if they define their patients as less than normal and therefore able to be shamed. So my talk today fits squarely within the discussion of medicine about the uses, misuses, and abuses of humor between clinicians and their patients. Many of these studies advocate for an understanding of the universality of the use of humor, and also challenge physicians to vent feelings without harming their interactions with their patients or even the patients themselves. While anthropologists tend to advocate for the lives of the vulnerable, it is also possible for an anthropologist to understand the frustrations of physicians in these hospitals I have worked with. These physicians witnessed many problems in their patients, and they tended to find it easier to shame the patients for their bad behavior, seemingly bad behavior, than blaming the larger system for placing these patients in vulnerable positions in the first place. However, because of a lack of reflection about the larger system, physicians shaming jokes not only reveal their class-based biases about their patients, but also continue to exacerbate them in their daily interactions. Understanding the roots of conflict between clinicians and their low-income patients and the way that humor or this kind of shame is used to mask and reveal these conflicts can help to improve quality of care. So both humiliation and shaming can be attributed to the poorly funded hospital system developed for impoverished populations, as well as a historically driven national discourse about class, gender, and ethnicity. Together, my findings suggest that providing adequate, humane, and ethical care, medical care for Mexico's poor is not merely a matter of founding or funding additional clinics, or even of providing better training for clinicians, but of actually trying to address some of these larger social and cultural dynamics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vania. This was an excellent and quite insightful, rich unpacking of the whole the gendered shame and towards understanding about, the violence, especially within the obstetric wards. I mean, this was really amazing. I have a ton of questions, but I'll keep that myself aside on later for discussion. But I'll open the floor for, the questions for others first. Please feel free to raise a question or raise a hand and we can take the questions. We have 15 minutes now for questions. Is that okay, Vania? Perfect. Yes, Dave.
Or is it? Were you calling on me, Giskin?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Vania, for that fascinating talk. Really interesting and horrifying in many ways. I wanted to ask how the physicians responded to your research, because I guess they might have perceived the very active making this visible as an instance of shaming them. When you gave your conclusions, and I was trying to put myself in the feet of or the shoes of the physicians that you were calling out, it seemed to me that they may perceive this as shaming them, and I just wondered whether you had any thoughts around that.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I have to say that in general, physicians have mostly responded well to this, but I had, it was in a different field site, and there was an obstetrician who, I just met him, and he asked me for copies of my articles so that he could read them to kind of get a sense of my work. And I sent him a bunch, and in one of them, I'm describing a doctor in a totally different hospital, who was the one who would manually dilate the cervix. And this other doctor, the original one in my writing, used to call this his technique. So he named it after himself, and he would, so I wrote about this in this article, the Reyes technique is what he would call it. So it was interesting how when this other obstetrician, the next time I met him, he's like, oh yeah, that's not how we behave. He was very defensive. But so I'd not thought about the idea of doctors feeling shamed from this. So I'm going to keep that in mind. I appreciate that particular perspective. But what's interesting is that when I first started my research, a decade and a bit ago, the idea of obstetric violence wasn't being spoken about in Mexico, wasn't a thing that was named. And over the past 8 years or so, it's been named. It's actually, there's policies in existence in Mexico against it. Hospitals are now talking about it. But you can tell that the doctors are feeling angry they're feeling that their normal obstetric practice is being questioned by people who don't know anything about doing obstetrics work, right? And so we've got this sort of friction that's still unfolding. So my more recent work actually has spent much more time. I've spent much more time trying to understand why doctors do what they do, how they think the way they do. So, it's interesting how they tend to feel. This is probably going to take me into different directions than where your question was, but just briefly, doctors tend to feel this. Any sort of critique against them, whether it's through a lawsuit, whether it's through policies, whether it's through things of this sort, they feel this as external violence, as sort of violence, this attack against their sense of self. And so the idea of shame hasn't come into my conversation there, but I'm going to keep it in mind. I hope this answered your question.
No, well, I think there is no answer, is it? It's, but you've addressed it. Because, I mean, I clearly think something needs to happen. This needs to be called out. But I can see how it attacks a sense of self and professional identity.
It does.
And norms. And that's very prevalent in medical, humor as a coping mechanism is often put forward as a justification, when actually it is a microaggression. So does that mean we cut out joking in medical practice, or is there a good way to do it? I think it's just fascinating questions. Thank you so much. And thank you for your sterling work. It's really important.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and especially the idea of humor. I mean, as a venting coping mechanism, it's necessary. Doctors have a really hard work, especially, now. And if they don't have a venting mechanism, the frustration could come out in much more noxious ways towards patients. So, but how to sort of balance the shaming or the violence within the humor itself, as opposed to it existing as a way for them to cope with life. So yeah, thank you.
Is there anyone else having questions? Yes, please. A comment by Zafi.
Hi. I wish I had like a very direct question to ask here, but maybe if you have something to riff on, I'd be curious. I'm in Canada, and we're having increasingly much more public conversations about violence against Indigenous people in the healthcare system, with a very extreme example coming out recently of a woman who filmed nurses making fun of her and shaming her while she was dying. So she died, her family got the phone and released the footage. And this is in the past, I believe, in the past 2 years. So I think either just pre or during the pandemic. And following that, I mean, obviously this is just a travesty, but much of the discussion publicly also focused on the nurse's denial that what happened was racism. And that, even more than the idea that they had taunted a woman while she was dying, became a real focus of the nurse's sort of resentment and pushback on what happened. Was really focusing on this idea that, like, we're not racist. And I'm wondering if that's something you've seen in Mexico, or if race is something that is not even talked about as part of the issue. I do have a question. There we go.
I'd not heard of that case. I'm going to look it up. That's horrifying for so many reasons. Like you say, not only the sort of laughter at someone dying, but then adding that sort of racist perspective into it. Mexico's relationship with race is very complicated, as it is anywhere. But I mean, and I don't know enough about how how it works in Canada, but in the US, people talk about race, especially, more recently, as something open that, the existence of racism. In many ways, in Mexico, to talk about race is considered impolite. So instead, people use terms like cultura, like culture. So they sort of use these like culturalist terms to still, differentiate between those who have culture and those who don't have culture. And yet, it's also used as those who have indigenous culture and those who are devoid of those problematics. So it's actually used in both ways. And I don't want to sort of do a plug for my new book, but I do mention this in there as sort of a big part of the ways that, the idea of culture sort of impregnated within these interactions. So they won't talk about race. They don't use the word raza. In fact, the word raza in Mexico is used almost in a positive way. So, in the US now there's like Indigenous Peoples Day as opposed to Columbus Day, which was, a big issue for many, many decades. Mexico has never spoken about Columbus Day. It's always been Dia de la Raza, the day of the creation of the Mexican identity. So the idea of raza is the sort of the melding, the mixing of the Spanish colonial with the indigenous, with some Afro as well. But they still use very, very, very racist language ideas, but it's couched within the more benign idea of cultura. So even indigenous people, some are obviously very politically active and self-identify as indigenous. And others don't use the word indigenous because the word indígena might be considered by their group or in their region as something shameful or negative. And so it's a mess. And there's occasional campaigns about sort of like unveiling racism. And you can find racism like in any TV show. Almost everyone is white, is light skinned, even if they're representing, people across the spectrum. All ads show the standards of beauty as being white. So you've got a country that is primarily composed of people who have darker brown skin, and yet the media shows a very different version of Mexican reality. So just, a long-winded answer to sort of say that race is definitely in there. It's just not spoken about overtly. I see a comment. I'm just going to check it out. Yeah, absolutely. That indigenous communities are leading lots of work on cultural safety. That's really interesting.
Right. And I mean, if no one has a question, I have a quick question to you regarding like the way the moral responsibility. I mean, if, for instance, from the individual point of view, as individual doctors, I mean, can we hold them accountable when they shame, or do you talk about time and resource? I mean, of course, in developing countries, this is like a key concern. Of course, we need an institutional level focus, but at the same time, like keep wondering. I mean, I want to hold them accountable for them to practice that, while also looking at the larger background and the institutional factors playing into it. But still, I don't want to let them go, or like off the hook for their behavior. I mean, because they consciously make the choice which patients they want to shame or humiliate. So I find it in a way to hold accountable, but I also don't want to, because of course healthcare professionals have their own challenges. So do you come up with these wrestling thoughts, and how do you engage with that?
No, you're absolutely right, Supriya. I struggle. The whole reason why my newer research was trying to understand where a lot of this behavior was coming from and focusing on doctors' lives was, try to, sort of move away from just a very overt criticism of these kind of issues and trying to hold them accountable. But then the more I interacted with them, the more I realized just how hard a lot of their life was, the scarcity of everything, but then also just the violence within the training, the pressures from the outside, the lack of jobs, all of these different possibilities or forces exerting pressure on them. It doesn't get them off the hook, like you say, but it's hard to hold them fully accountable for everything, when some of this might have its origins in frustration, but then, like you say, they do take a choice as to which patients they are more likely to humiliate. My research hasn't yet addressed this, but I've wanted to, like, lots of doctors in Mexico work 2 jobs, medical jobs. Sometimes they'll work in a private hospital, sometimes they'll work in a public one. From anecdotal conversations, they practice different medicine and interactions with patients in each one, right? So that really does suggest that there's something that needs to hold them accountable for how they interact with the non-paying patients, because with the paying patients, they will treat them very differently. They won't sort of just probe and touch and cut and do stuff without permission. And so if the same doctor can practice things differently, then there is something that is more than just structural, that is something about the individual decisions and the sort of leeway that they feel that they can have with a certain type of patient. But this is probably like, you know, I don't want to say it's my life's work. That seems too arrogant, but it's like a question that I think will sort of continue, because it's that sort of like hard balance, as you say.
No, it's really, I mean, it opens up a huge questions into like individual versus institutional level. But yeah, thank you so much, Vania. Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was great. But yeah, I'm a bit similar to the first question. I'm really interested in what the doctors themselves, how did they conceptualize this kind of joking and shaming stuff? I mean, did you interview physicians who, reflected on it as something they shouldn't be doing, or did they think they were kind of creating rapport, or were they defensive, or what was their kind of reaction to? Or did they not see, I don't know, if you had these direct conversations, did they not see what they were doing as anything wrong? Like, did they directly relate it to compliance themselves, or how, what did they think about it?
Each doctor reflected on them differently. Some certainly never thought of their comments as anything but creating rapport. Like the doctor who was joking with the 18-year-old about her laziness, he did this with all patients. He thought it was a way of establishing rapport. Others, definitely spoke about their patients in very negative terms, like I've described, talking about them as having low IQ, and so they didn't reflect too much on their behavior. And that's something that I would like to actually go back and talk much more about, like, okay, we've seen this happen. How do you fully explain, that behavior? So my next project is trying to have a more sort of like, connecting these dots with the doctors, not only about language, but also about procedures. Like, okay, so you say that you should only do 10% of this type of procedure. Well, you seem to be doing it with 90%. So like, how do you justify, or what's the rationale for that? So I don't have enough of a cohesive answer for you at this point, Sarah. Sorry.
So we are almost time, but we have one last question. Maybe can we take this last question and then go for a break? Is that okay with everyone?
That's okay with me.
Yeah, Erin, please.
I was just wondering, because obviously you've been working in this field for a very long time. And so I was wondering if during that time you've noticed any change in kind of the severity of these microaggressions. And also in terms of the future, kind of, are you optimistic? Do you think that they might improve, or how do you think that's going to go?
That's a good question. I haven't noticed a change in, well, that's a really good question. And in some ways, I have seen some changes, especially like doctors speaking about obstetric violence, but then getting defensive about, well, all my medical practice is now considered obstetrically violent, so how can I do this? There's still presence of all of these. They might just hide it a little bit better. I have to admit, I haven't been to the field since 2018. I was meant to start a project then, and then pandemic and all of that sort of fun stuff. And so my more recent work 2018 was just a pilot work, and 2016 was my longest one with a lot of these doctors, and I could still see a lot of these behaviors. And one in the private hospital, which I didn't really mention much today, it had a small foundation where it would care for charity patients. And they received different type of care than the paying patients within that same hospital. So does it give me hope? I mean, I think if any of these policies against gender-based violence or obstetric violence had any kind of legal repercussions, or they could really be set up in a way for it to be a conversation as opposed to just punitive. Because I think the doctors are feeling that it's all punitive, right? And so they're getting defensive about it. They're talking much more about defensive medicine, which was never a thing. So hope for the future. I do have hope if this can become a conversation about medical care as a larger thing, as opposed to just these sort of microaggressions, right? Looking at it structurally. I hope that answers your question, Erin.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
So Vanya, we have a couple of quick questions and also comments on the chat box. How about like we take 10 minutes break and come back, and then during the discussion, we can continue this discussion. It sounds good for everyone?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, perfect. So let's meet in 10 minutes for Sarah's talk. And we are looking forward for the next and then for the open discussion. See you all soon. Hi, Sarah. Shall we start? Or should we wait for another 1 minute?
Sure.
Yeah. So welcome back to the second session of today's session on workshop series on respect and shame in healthcare and bioethics workshop series. So now we have Sarah Howard, is a postdoctoral fellow at Birmingham, and also will be shortly joining Birbeck as part of the larger project on history of global health. So her PhD, which was awarded in 2020, is an account of Ethiopia's developmental state through the everyday lives of its lowest level employees. Based primarily on long-term ethnographic research, the thesis explores how bodies, materials, and substances are integral to the continual construction of the state. So today she will be discussing shame techniques by community-led total sanitation programs in the context of developmental state, and its longer histories, as well as religious and cultural norms and practices which privilege particular body modes of self. So I'm so excited and looking forward to your talk, and please, over to you.
Thank you. Right. There we go. Can everyone see? Good. Okay. So, thank you for the introduction, Supriya, and thank you for the invitation to talk. It's such an interesting workshop series, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. Yeah, so my paper that I'm going to give today is about I'm going to give an ethnographic example of a public health program that harnessed shame as a means of bringing about behavioural change in rural Ethiopia. This program, called Community-Led Total Sanitation, or CLTS, is an approach to promoting rural latrine use that aims to govern communal behaviour through invoking disgust in order to provoke shame. So my presentation will explore how a hybrid form of CLTS came to be enacted in one area of Amhara region in Ethiopia, and how invoking shame had ultimately only limited success in persuading local people to build latrines. So it's going to be in 3 sections. First, I'm going to introduce the origins, techniques, and assumptions of CLTS and how it came to be introduced in Ethiopia. Then some ethnographic material on how the program was actually implemented in where I did my research in one particular rural context. And finally, on how locally important ideas about self-discipline influence understandings of disgust and shame. So, CLTS is an approach to promoting rural latrine use that began in Bangladesh in 1999. It has its origins in previous participatory approaches that spread in Africa and South Asia in the 1990s, drawing on the emancipatory philosophy of radical educationist Paulo Freire, which emphasizes participation and local ownership. The founder of CLTS, Kamal Kar, an Indian agriculturalist, was trained in participatory rural approaches and worked closely with the person who was important in founding them, Robert Chambers. And CLTS was an innovation from those approaches in terms of its focus on a single issue and in its willingness to use confrontation and even conflict compared to the focus on facilitation found in other PRA approaches. It spread rapidly in the 2000s and was touted as a global development success story. One working paper calls it a radical alternative to conventional top-down approaches to sanitation. CLTS manuals and handbooks provide many methods through which to trigger, that's the word they use, trigger or ignite communities into action, most of which are centered on telling people that they are eating each other's shit. Using popular or crude words equivalent to shit in local languages is part of the technique. These methods include, one of the main ones is the defecation area transect walk, otherwise known as the walk of shame, which involves walking around the neighborhood to see where people shit. Advice on this method from the handbook is to spend as much time there as possible asking questions while people inhale the smell of their shit and feel uncomfortable at having brought an outsider there. Calculation of shit is another key method in which members of the community discuss and calculate the average amount of shit one person produces per day and multiply that amount by the number of members of the family and community as a whole by week, month and year, and write it all down on a flip chart. Other methods include water and shit, involving a hair dipped in shit and then in a glass of water, which people are asked if they would drink, and food and shit. In this last method, facilitators collect raw shit and a plate of food is kept next to the shit quietly. Fresh food and raw shit quickly attract flies, which start moving between the two. Often reactions lead to women spitting profusely or even vomiting. And this is a photo from the handbook, well, from a special journal issue on CLTS, showing a woman who's just finished vomiting. Other creative tools for bypassing disgust and directly inciting shame are also listed in the literature. I'll mention just one from Zimbabwe, which was labelled, "Your wife is known." So this is a quote. "I tell the community that on my way to the meeting, I met a man who claims to know all the women from the village. Locally, knowing a woman means having been intimate with her. Since no man would want his woman to be seen naked by another man, this message shocks the men. I then ask the villagers how it's possible that the man got to know all the women in the village, and it becomes clear that the women were seen defecating in the open. This encourages the men to protect their women by constructing latrines." So once this is discussed, which is assumed to be imminent within all people and communities, has been triggered, the CLTS model assumes that people will experience what they call a social awakening and will leap up and seize their shovels to start digging latrine pits. But if they don't, another important part of CLTS is community-devised punishments for those who don't immediately comply. Examples quoted approvingly in the official international handbook include encouraging children, who are described as particularly appropriate vehicles for administering humiliating punishments, to yell, scream or blow whistles to draw attention to anyone shitting outside, or even make little flags with someone's name on them and put them in a pile of shit. Examples from Ethiopia describe even more extreme forms of vigilante-style humiliation. A case study from the south of the country in one report describes how open defecation has gradually become a taboo, and a triple punishment is doled out to offenders. For example, villagers come to see the offender in the nude, make him pick up his shit with his bare hands and scoop it into a latrine. So there's a lot I could discuss in terms of wider histories of how states and empires have used narratives of hygiene, dirt and contamination to govern populations, but don't have the time for that today. So I will skip forward to the 1980s, when water and sanitation became an important focus in international development, with the UN declaration of the International Drinking Water Supply and Sanitation Decade. So this coincided with both the large-scale implementation of structural adjustment programs in the Global South and an emphasis on self-reliance and community-based approaches. So subsidy or self-respect, the title of the working paper co-authored by the founder of CLTS, shows how participatory bottom-up action is compatible with neoliberal development models in its placing of the responsibility for managing human shit with individuals rather than with states. One of the core ideas of CLTS is that providing any kind of financial or material support dampens true ownership of toilets, and that triggering should instead lead to spontaneous local action using local materials. So CLTS then is not a technology, but a technique. In its lack of material form, it's unlike pee-poos, another sanitation innovation described in Kenya by Peter Redfield. Pee poos are biodegradable plastic bags covered with a pathogen neutralizing substance designed to stop the use of flying toilets or normal plastic bags that are used to dispose of shit in urban slums usually. There is a similarity between CLTS and pee poos, however, in the valorization of action and responsibility to be taken not by the state, but by individuals in the case of the pee poo, and some judicious combination of individual, household and community in the case of CLTS. The CLTS method was explicitly designed in reaction to decades of development projects that saw state and non-state actors build or supply toilets for household and communities that went unused or were eventually abandoned. So the idea instead is to ignite the desire for toilets, and this desire is supposedly smothered by the provision of the actual items themselves. So a central pillar of the method is that no support should be given in cash or in kind to those whose desire for a toilet has been awakened, even to the very poorest households. Those with no resources are supposed to start with the construction of a basic pit latrine by digging a hole in the ground and building a superstructure from mud, wood, stones, or whatever locally available materials they can find. And in this, they're acting as barefoot innovators, according to the literature. In the CLTS model, the myriad benefits of being a latrine user are supposed to spur aspirations for the even greater benefits, especially increased social status, that would arise from improvements to the latrine. This should happen in concert with the household becoming more financially successful, in part through circumventing medical expenses that were the result of not having a toilet. So, you know, especially diarrhea or diseases that you supposedly will no longer suffer from. In this way, the household will ascend the ladder towards the end point of a poor flush toilet via a septic tank or biogas digester. Anthropologist Stephen Robbins describes community activists in South Africa hurling portable toilets into Cape Town's public spaces in protest at the government's providing shack dwellers with portable rather than proper, permanent, modern flush toilets. But in the sanitation ladder used in the CLTS literature, plumbed flushable toilets are not even at the top of the ladder, an ideal too far for rural people to even aspire towards, apparently. A septic tank or a biogas digester may be used by more than one household, but they remain localized forms of shit disposal, unlike, as Margaret Morgan writes, a plumbing system that literally, physically links the individual home with the larger state. Despite its origins then, CLTS methods and assumptions are in accord with neoliberal injunctions for market-based solutions. They are also compatible with the cultivation of individualized responsibility through what Brenda Chalfin calls biopolitical prescription, the interiorization of sanitation and bodily waste as fundamental to individual well-being and to a broader project of societal improvements. Cost and responsibility are shifted from supplier to consumer. One NGO working in Ethiopia reported that they used to spend $25 US per sanitary platform for sanitary platform provision alone. But with CLTS, costs amount to the equivalent of less than $1 per latrine, as all labours and material are being covered by the community themselves. So that's how the programme is supposed to work. It was introduced in Ethiopia in various locations in 2006, but it had a precursor, which was an initiative by a regional health bureau in the southern part of the country. So after CLTS was introduced in Ethiopia, it was hybridized with this state sanitation program. The SNMPR program was similar in that it aimed at 100% latrine coverage with no subsidies, but the major difference was that it made latrines compulsory, enforced through state structures and linked to, in this case, political mobilization around the 2005 elections. In 2006, the founder Kamal Kar came to Ethiopia and ran a training workshop, and international NGOs initially disseminated the method in the south of the country. As other NGOs and bilateral and multilateral organisations were drawn in through workshops, meetings and available funding, the state-driven approach was gradually subsumed under the CLTS label. And by 2008, the Ministry of Health had designated it as the key to achieving national goals on sanitation and hygiene. So I became interested in the topic of CLTS when I was working for an NGO in Addis Ababa. And I came across these startling public shaming techniques that they advocated. And then became especially intrigued after my former colleagues had an experience. They returned to the office from a rural area with reports of nearly being physically attacked when they tried to stage a CLTS triggering event. They recounted that local people had been perturbed by the language and subject matter of the event and then became intensely angry to the point of threatening violence when my colleagues tried to introduce some physical shit into the proceedings as per the CLTS guidelines. So that interest led me to I studied the topic for my MA dissertation, and I conducted research in the Northern Shoa zone of Amhara region, as this map shows, because I knew that had been one of the areas where there had been a CLTS intervention, and that led eventually to my doctoral research. So I carried out research in this area in different periods between 2010 and 2016. So now I'm going to move to the local. So in 2007, prior to the planned arrival of the World Bank-led CLTS project in my research area, local health officials told me that they'd counted all the latrines in the district. They arrived at a figure of 979 latrines for a total population of nearly 18,500 people. But by the beginning of 2010, after the World Bank intervention had happened and been handed over to local state employees, the number of latrines had apparently shot up to 17,000, nearly one for every man, woman and child resident, and enough for the designation of ODF, or open defecation free. These clearly invented statistics could be explained away as a fault in the implementation of this apparently globally successful program. Development practitioner research often studies the gap between policies on paper and the gap that appears when these policies are put into practice. And this gap is often blamed on the capacity, behaviour or propensity for corruption of the lowest level workers. But my aim was not to analyse whether government workers were effective or ineffective in their implementation of policy. Instead, I show how they work very hard to implement contradictory, or as Vina Das calls them, illegible policies, and navigate their unintended consequences. For example, CLTS is explicitly designed to discourage target-oriented approaches, which degenerate into counting latrines, according to Carr and Chambers. However, under Ethiopia's EPRDF government from the early 90s to 2018, the Ethiopian state heavily relied upon statistical knowledge to build their capacity for economic planning in support of their developmental agenda. Health workers were upwardly accountable through benchmark performance indicators for implementing government directives on sanitation improvement through the auditing and documentation of latrine numbers, as this chart shows. Furthermore, in the key attitudes and behaviours encouraged by CLTS, government workers were not supposed to, quote, educate, lecture or tell people what to do, tell people what's good and bad, push for or demand action, or be in charge, even if people were not interested in building their own latrines. Nor were they supposed to provide subsidies for even the poorest households. So the idea that building latrines would just come about through these interventions, and that if it didn't happen, then it should be countered by community-devised demeaning punishments. This was something I mentioned to health workers in North Shoa who were shocked and denied that it could possibly be the case. People are not allowed to make up their own punishments, they insisted. Only the government can punish people by law. So galvanizing a supposedly community-led process of change, but without being in charge or telling anyone what to do, or providing any material help, while also meeting their own targets measured through auditing processes, put the government workers in an impossible position despite their best efforts. And they also faced resistance, both overt and performative, as I'll now describe. So Ahmed was a middle-aged farmer who'd attended one of the CLTS events organised by the World Bank in 2009. He subsequently became a community health volunteer who assisted the salaried health extension workers. As it was clear someone would have to volunteer, his neighbours pushed him forward as a suitably respected person to take on the role. But in addition, Ahmed told me he did have his own motivations for stepping up. He wrinkled up his face and looked pained when he remembered the methods employed at the 2009 event. He found especially disgusting the calculation of how many quintals or 100 kilograms of shit were deposited in the open spaces around the village every year. After the event, Ahmed tried his best to persuade his neighbours to build latrines. There were immediate adopters like him, and some who yielded to his persuasion over time, but others simply would not comply, no matter how hard he tried. He summed up their attitude in the quote that on this slide. These resistors were largely in two groups. The first were young landless men, those who've been described by researcher René Lefort as suspended in the air, still counted as part of their parents' households while waiting for periodic land distribution of state-owned land, even if they live separately with a family of their own and rent land. They pay no land tax in their own names, which means that they're cut off from formal participation in political structures. Often, these young men were among those who illegally migrated to the Middle East, and they were also more likely to be or suspected to be opposition supporters. As one young man told me, the government knows people by their land. Unless he gives tax for the government by his land, no one knows whether he's alive or not. So their inability to achieve fully adult status that led to their partial exclusion from the public realm made them resistant to any influence on domestic autonomy, as the pressure to build a latrine was perceived to be. The second group to openly resist were those who'd held local government positions under the previous Derg regime, the communist regime from 1974 to 91, known as the bureaucracy. Despite their vilification in the 90s post-Derg era, the bureaucracy have often managed to maintain or even expand their social and economic status, and they played a key role in rural opposition in the 2005 elections, which were very significant in recent Ethiopian politics as being relatively openly contested. At local level, the bureaucracy articulated their opposition in part through lack of respect for health extension workers and their allies, as Ahmed shows in this quote, and through scorning the latrine programme as an overt form of dissent. I found a quote from the Times newspaper of 1854, an editorial, and I thought this sums up the bureaucracy's attitude of resistance to sanitary reforms quite nicely. Yeah, an 1854 Times newspaper editor dissented from the introduction of a waterborne sewage system in London with the statement, "We prefer to take our chance of cholera and the rest than be bullied into health." Rather than obfuscating or objecting on practical grounds to latrines, both young landless men and the bureaucracy perceived all state intervention as political. They refused the relation with the state, that acceding to shame-based persuasion, threat, or order to build a latrine by those representing the government would have implied. Elsewhere in the area, some explicitly mobilised the politics of shit. In the aftermath of the violently contested 2005 elections, a group of young men in a nearby area destroyed all the new latrines in the area as symbols of the illegitimate and intrusive power of the state. So we get to the fake latrines of my title. As well as this open dissent, there were many other residents who put on a performance of compliance by building fake latrines. These shallow pits, sometimes barely ankle deep, were surrounded by leaning piles of grass or bamboo, were visibly unused and cheerfully acknowledged to be quickly built for the report so that they could be counted as existing and fend off intrusion into their households by government workers. As one man told a health extension worker, "My neighbours, everyone here has a latrine, everyone, but I'm dead sure that no one uses it. You people," meaning government workers, "watch every home. You see the latrines, but you don't see when they go to shit." Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk about disgust and shame. Following Mary Douglas's seminal insights into the social ordering functions of dirt, there have been a limited number of anthropologists who have directly addressed the subject of the substance of shit. Jacques van der Geest reviews the extant anthropological literature on cross-cultural attitudes to shit and concludes that feces does indeed have a natural dirtiness due to its physical qualities, especially its smell, but that disgust must be at least partly acquired rather than inherent, given the fascination that infants have with their own shit. Nor is all feces equal in its capacity to incite disgust. Reactions vary based on its producer. He says that the shit of someone known but not intimate is much more disgusting than one's own or one's children's. The ethnographic evidence described by Van der Geest, for example, mothers in Cameroon who said that the caca of their babies did not smell and were not at all repulsive to them, are backed up by a clinical study that found that mothers ranked their own baby's shit as less disgusting than others when presented with unmarked dirty nappies. Different reactions to shit also depend upon place and species. Animal feces is seen as much less offensive than human, with gradations between animals, comparing dog shit and a cow pat, for example. Martha Nussbaum claims that disgust is not natural, but rather created by social prohibitions, and its direction towards the body and its products has collaborated with the maintenance of injurious social hierarchies. Her assertion is that disgust is a fundamentally immoral emotion, whose cognitive content is more likely than not to be false or distorted and linked with self-deception. This is part of an attempt to build a moral theory of emotion, especially in the legal sphere, a central component of which lies in the actuating of sympathetic identification or tolerance, emotions blocked, according to Nussbaum, by disgust. So according to this line of thought, the methods of CLTS paradoxically tried to build sympathetic identification within communities by and through provoking disgust with each other. The fundamental message of the triggering methods is that if I shit outside, you will eat my shit. The proponents of CLTS would argue that the disgust is intended to be directed at the material substance of the shit itself, not at those who produce it in the wrong place. But the endorsement of vigilante-style punishment and humiliation suggests somewhat differently. These punishments actually were not something that happened in my research area, as I discussed above, but here I want to discuss another way in which disgust is denaturalized through forms of self-discipline. So writing about Orthodox Christian Amhara women with obstetric fistula, a medical condition usually caused by prolonged labor that leads to the uncontrollable leaking of urine and or feces from the body. Anthropologist Anita Hanig explores how the women maintain their moral identities as Orthodox Christian subjects in the context of the spiritual significance of the purity and integrity of the body. She shows how their adherence to modes of self-discipline within the corporal limits of their injury allows them to retain an ethical self-position. So I'm interested here in her idea of self-discipline as a means of transcending disgust, meaning that the physical substance of feces is not always and equally disgusting, as Van der Geest suggests. In Hanig's ethnography, self-discipline can provide a social and moral identity that surpasses the uncontrollability of nature and to some extent mitigates their experiences of shame. In the case of rural women with no latrines, self-discipline is required for them to limit their need to defecate to the hours of darkness, which is a reason sometimes, or quite often, given by NGOs and sanitation promotion programs to explain the pressing need for latrines and alleviate this bad culture. But darkness does not necessarily designate this as an individual or private experience. As one woman told me, we like to go together to shit in the field. It's more fun with your friends. And several others told me that it was not shameful to go to the fields at night for defecation, even if others saw or knew your purpose, or even saw you while you were in the act. How could it be shameful? One woman asked me, when it's a habit that everyone has. Here we see it's not the bodily substance itself that causes disgust, but rather the lack of bodily discipline and therefore social competence that defecating in the daytime would indicate. Hanig writes that among Amhara Christians, the careful management of orifices is linked to cleanliness, self-control, food consumption, procreation, disease prevention, and more broadly, sociality, evident through private forms of self-discipline, integral to Ethiopian orthodoxy. In this context, disgust is less an innate and individual response to a physical substance than instrumental to constructing social relationships through a display of admirable self-regulation. CLTS wasn't entirely and a total failure. It did, as I'm now in my last point going to make, it did have some effects in one particular village. As I've discussed, the disgust engendered by CLTS methods is supposed to have a physical and visceral effect on individual bodies. And the next step is for the individual physical evocation of disgust to transform into the social emotion of shame. Shame is fundamentally a relational emotion evoked when we imagine or experience the judgment of others about something we've done. And as such, it has a close relationship with social norms and assumptions. The method I mentioned above, labeled "Your Wife Is Known," is an example of how shame about women's bodies and bodily functions can be co-opted into CLTS. The gendered moral valency of shame was also evident in the fact that in my research area, there was only one village that was wholly Muslim in this sub-district, and it had a markedly more positive attitude to latrines than anywhere else. And the quantity and quality of latrines there was much higher. This slide is a picture of one of those much more high quality latrines. The residents there explicitly linked their desire for high quality latrines to the importance of cleanliness and modesty in Islam, especially for women. Women I talked to there mentioned the shame they felt if they came across men when using a common defecation area. And men talked specifically about protecting the dignity of their daughters and wives, which was language I didn't hear elsewhere in the district. So, in conclusion, my ethnographic research has shown the various ways in which the use of disgust and shame to trigger latrine building did not overall work as intended and was resisted, elided, and transformed by multiple actors. In the context of the Ethiopian developmental state, with its emphasis on the role of vanguards in directing citizens to participate in their developmental duties, I've shown that CLTS was an illegible policy that, despite their labour, public servants were not able to make legible. Furthermore, religious and cultural norms and practices that privilege particular bodily modes of self-discipline show that shit is not experienced always and equally as disgusting or shameful. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is quite wonderful and also quite rich in itself to understand shit and then shaming aspects and whether it's a self-disciplining mechanism or how the state intervenes. I mean, quite at different layers you can engage with this concept and how the state intervention is important or not. And shaming is a good practice for public health agenda. I mean, we can have a rich discussion around it, of course. But I would request Vania to give feedback and then we can open the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. This was a fascinating presentation, and I had the privilege of reading your entire paper, which I thoroughly enjoyed. It's as you've said, it's a topic where you're exploring the ways that some of these programs have been created to elicit disgust and shame regarding human feces. So as you've said, you've addressed this system called the community-led total sanitation, the CLTS, to promote rural sanitation use. And so you walked the readers through your paper, as well as today's audience, through the origins of the CLTS in Bangladesh. You connect to the historical and colonial concerns, which I know you didn't have time to go into today, but I thought that was a really rich part of the paper, the sort of like the sort of relationship between individuals of the state in both the UK and other parts of Europe, as well as sort of exporting these concepts to the colonies, I think was really interesting. And then, of course, you bring it all back into sort of your research in Ethiopia. It's a really nicely written paper, and as I said, I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, as well as hearing your talk today. My comments are brief, but I hope they'll be helpful. So I really like how you address Mary Douglas's ideas of purity and danger, especially the idea of matter out of place. And I mean, as she said, you know, dirt isn't dirty until it's not where it should be. And so, for instance, like shoes on the floor, it's fine, but shoes on the table are dirty. So it's a sort of, you know, this displacement. Or, you know, food on a plate or in a closed chewing mouth is fine. But when we see someone with food on their teeth, we have an almost like instinctive desire to licking our own lips, trying to sort of get them to, like, you know, elicit their mimicry and removing that matter out of place. And so you use this heuristic really nicely throughout this paper, especially how you move us through the very visceral ideologies of CLTS to elicit disgust and shame. But then you add the nuance to the narrative by showing how in other contexts, shit is not shameful. Like the people, and you didn't quite mention that in the talk today, but I thought that was really good, you know, how people think about feces as part of returning fertility to the soil. So it's a sort of relationship of the human with the soil, and it's this sort of fertile relationship of sort of plants and animals, and then, you know, produced into food, consumed and returned in a different matter, but sort of creating this cycle. Or like you described, the women shitting together as something communal and social. Or the mothers not being disgusted by the children's feces, or like you said, with Anita Hanig's work of women with fistulas who work towards maintaining the purity and integrity of their bodies. So what I like about these examples is the sociality or the value of shit as something, you know, social or fertile, that then surpasses the perceived natural disgust of shit as a item, as a product. I would add a couple of things to this idea, or maybe one primary thing. For instance, people with colorectal cancer who have had a stoma created and have to change their ostomy bag. So there these people shift their relationship to shit, not to something produced from a rectum, but instead something collected in a bag that they have to handle and empty. And so I can envision ways by which ideas of shame could be part of these patients or people as they learn to live with their stomas. The potential shame of being found out, or and seen, or worse, smelt, right, by others, could be a significant part of their experiences as they sort of, I guess, you know, recreate or create a new relationship with their bodies, but also with the feces that they're producing. So I think this sort of adds to the nuance that you've already been exploring by using Mary Douglas's and Anita Hanig's work, etc. Another point is that I think more could be said regarding some of your ideas about disciplining the unruly bodies and how societies structure space and interactions based on perceptions of hygiene, modernity, and worth. And you didn't really talk about that today, but you have a nice section on that in the paper. So you mentioned some really interesting examples from Ethiopia, but I wonder if there are more differences regarding perceptions of hygiene and dirtiness based on race or color or language origins, that's sort of urban/rural, or religion. And you unpack quite a bit about the religion with the example of the Muslim village and how they had a very different relationship to shame and trains and other places. But, you know, I wonder if there are any other differences that, you know, you would want to elaborate on. And perhaps there are none, right? But I would love to hear more about this, especially as you spent quite a bit of time, a big part of your paper, talking about these distinctions and how historically in Europe and there was this sort of, you know, class-based, modernity-based perceptions of latrines, of sanitation, and how they then export these beliefs to their colonies, and then, you know, it becomes this sort of relationship with the other people that they interact with and control based on surveillance, of discipline, regulation, etc. And so with that, I wonder if, does shaming work more for some groups than others, which of course you did mention, these sort of gradations in Ethiopia. And I wonder what are some of the consequences of being shamed in some of these places, right? And so, wanting to connect the dots a little bit more. You didn't mention it today, but in your paper, you talk about how studies of shit have been ignored or rejected within the anthropological discipline. That was fascinating because it shows not only, there was a disgust at the topic and even shaming of those who engage in it as somehow lesser scholars or somehow morally or intellectually lacking. And I wonder if this is still the case now, and if so, what prompted you to work on this, right? Like if there's still this sort of perception of shame within the discipline of like it's an untouchable topic. How do you position yourself within this? Because I think it's fascinating. So I would love to hear more about your relationship to it as a topic. Then talking about the CLTS, I mean, their methods were fascinatingly horrifying. Their systems to trigger and elicit disgust are really out there. Their methods to shame people are drastic, as you described, the sort of bringing in piles of poo and close contact with food, or doing that walk of shame, or adding that gendered perspective, like you mentioned in Zimbabwe, of knowing men's wives, because they're behind, they're exposed to the world. But then the fact that this technique is so neoliberal was such a sort of messed up part of the whole, ideology in my perspective, like shaming people, making them feel disgusted, and then telling them, well, actually, now you need to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and pay for the materials and build latrines yourself. That was so fascinating. And that somehow people's desires for toilets is latent. And all it takes is some shaming to spark it is a really interesting part of their whole philosophy, which is of course contradicted by your very rich ethnographic data in Ethiopia, and how shame or how this disgust isn't latent. It might just be a latent thing in some countries, or latent, it probably isn't latent in anyone. And that in other places, the sociality of shit, overshadows any of this shame. So as I was reading this, I couldn't help but thinking of this system as a cult. First they come in and they shame people. They make them see themselves as less than others because of their fecal practices. And then they hold up metaphorical mirrors to their lives. Even the idea of awakening is sort of this very sort of cultish way of sort of sparking a connection of people to their bodily shame. And then once they've elicited this disgust through these shaming mechanisms, then tell them, well, now you're on this sanitation ladder and you have to do it yourself. And so the cultish nature of this scatological ideology, and then it's sort of like developed incrementally, right? As you move up the ladder, you become more enlightened, more awakened, and you have access to more hygiene and less shame. Of course, the Ethiopian people that you encountered, who tricked the system and created their fake latrines, was a really fascinating form of resistance, as they still went to the trouble of building something akin to a latrine, even if only, like you say, ankle deep, but they're not using it as such. So, I just love the sort of resistance to the ideological cultish nature of this. And then just some minor points, so I don't take too much time, but one is you mentioned that animal feces is seen as less offensive than human feces. I certainly agree. But I would also add that the reason why we're less offended by cow poo as opposed to cat poo is probably a distinction based on the animal diets. So herbivore poo tends to be less smelly and even have a different consistency than that of carnivores. And so, cow poo is even used in some places for fuel or flooring, right? So it has a sort of very different sort of, it's almost perceived as entirely different matter. Edmund Leach, decades ago, and as well as others, have done analyses of farting and how in different contexts these can elicit disgust or even be seen as medically necessary, or even something to be proud of. And the same could be true of belching. So where in some contexts, belching after a meal is a compliment to the chef. So we have these sort of cultural systems that create categories of shame about bodily functions, where in some places there might be no shame attached, and in others there's significant shame. And then there's work also from a few decades ago by anthropologists who were looking at how mothers classify their children's as diarrhea based on color and texture and smell. And so this connects to your point about mothers not being disgusted by their children's as feces, but it also might connect more broadly with Douglas's idea of matter out of place, because nowhere is diarrhea, acceptable, even within the body, right? The idea of sort of having to get the matter out. So diarrhea as a particular type of feces might occupy a very different space in any of these conversations about shit. So, just a sort of other ethnographic example of the sort of in-betweenness of disgust and matter out of place. And then as you were talking, I have a final point, which is the idea of open defecation, the idea of sort of danger to women. Like you talk about it sort of being a social thing where women go and shit together, but in other places it could place them in dangerous situations where there might be more of targets of violence, rape, for instance. Lots of examples of this across the world, including refugee camps, just across the border, like in Sudan or Kenya. So latrines could be connected to questions of potentially mitigating gender-based violence. So, part of the conversation, and I'm sure you've addressed a lot of this in other work, but this was, my only window into your work on this. So those were my comments. As I say, I thoroughly enjoyed your paper.
Sarah, please, do you have any responses, or do you want to just engage with Vania about the comments which she just suggested?
Sure, just briefly, yeah. Thank you so much, Vania. That's really nice to hear. Yeah, it's really, really interesting comments, and the idea of CLTS as a cult has given me some food for thought. I mean, what I think I put it on one of the slides, but I didn't really discuss it, is that it's had its day, actually. And also due to COVID, I haven't been back. Well, I was supposed to go in the last 2 years and haven't, but I can now see by looking online that actually last year there was a big CLTS website, and it's now disappeared, and it's been changed into, it's sort of been subsumed into a generalized sanitation hub. And I was just looking on that this morning, and they do not, they've actually literally relabeled some of the stuff, some of the materials that was in a series called, whatever, Focus on CLTS, and they've literally renamed it. So, and I've also seen that there've been some systematic reviews that have said this doesn't appear to work. There's no good evidence. We're very concerned about rights issues, gender issues, and they're very much taking it away from the idea of shame and trying to talk about dignity and the positive benefits it will bring you. So I think the moment that I'm describing has passed. And, really that's not surprising, because like you say, when you read some of the things that they recommended people do, I mean, it was shocking and also kind of ridiculous, and not very likely to actually happen in the real world in a lot of places. But that is the reason I became interested in it, because it was my I was working in Addis at the time, and I in water and sanitation, and it came up, and I sort of saw how, despite a lot of misgivings, especially by Ethiopian staff, I can say, the money and the interest was there from the people with the funding, and it came to be national policy, not in a very not that it was a conspiracy, but it happened like that. And like you said, one of the things that was really ignored, one of the misgivings, was about this there's another strand in this sanitation world of eco-san, so using composting toilets. And the people who were concerned with that, and a lot of them were Swedish, were really concerned that this was completely the wrong message in terms of, in terms of using shit as fertilizer, which was something that a lot, that local people also told me. It's like, well, actually, it's good for the field, so we like doing it there, and that's another reason, which, as you said, I didn't mention. But yeah, it seems that CLTS's day as a scatological cult has to some extent come and gone. Yes, thank you, Lorna. I'm sure it will evolve into something else, but yeah, and as for it being an embarrassing topic and not much studied, I honestly can admit that I did feel a little bit like that, and it started off being my whole topic. In fact, my PhD proposal was to be entirely about this topic until I realised, it's very theoretically interesting, but in the life of a local area, people barely even remembered it had happened, really, in the shaming stuff specifically. So I went much broader than that, but when I was telling people that this was my research topic, I did feel embarrassed. And I'm just going to read really quickly. This is a bit that I missed out of the that was in the paper, but that I didn't discuss because I just find it quite funny. It was the lack of attention to the subject of shit in anthropology is the social or professional pressure faced by those who would address the issue, but fear others will scorn the topic as silly, prurient, or just gross. The editors of a special edition of Post-Colonial Studies reported hostility when they issued a call for papers on the subject of toilets. Angry readers wrote into the editors describing the topic as trivial and male, interesting, and said that there is no need to take this subject seriously in any way. And another author wrote an article about shit and its disposal, and she got comments underneath asking whether the author is the author a scat freak? Is this all some giant experiment to see if we have no sense of class or dignity? So in that vein, yeah, I did sometimes feel uncomfortable, and I would not actually really describe what my research topic was. So these things are powerful, aren't they? Yeah, I don't know if I've addressed all your comments, but I will leave. I'll stop there and let anyone else comment.
You did. Thank you, Sarah. That was great.
Right. Thank you, Vania, for the comments, and thank you, Sarah, for responding. As short it could, right? But we have a couple of questions on the comment sections by Lorna. Like, do you want to raise a question? Or she has a quick comment there and even a question. Does this include creating a desire for sitting instead of squatting? So I think she mentioned when you were presenting. So Lorna, do you want to elaborate on this?
No, I think that's the question. It was just when you were talking about this creating a desire for a different value, and I just wondered if that included an aspiration to sit instead of squat.
I mean, I think no, it didn't, because the idea of having a sit-on flushable toilet was, like I said, that was a step too far. That was seen as something urban, and that was never going to happen. So it was very much all about the latrines. Yeah, but oh, okay, someone's. Yeah, other African countries. I mean, I haven't done research in other African countries, so I don't know. But it would be really interesting to make a comparison of, the sort of colonial histories and hygiene, sanitation, promotion. There's Warwick Anderson has written about the Philippines. I mean, there's a lot of writing about it, but in terms of this particular program, I don't know if anyone's done anything, and if, yeah, potentially it would be a good comparison, looking at the history of it.
Right.
There's another long question.
Yeah, Linda has. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know how it relates to nudge theory in terms of kind of international development stuff. I mean, it seems, you know, humiliating and public shaming seems quite a difference from nudge. I mean, I don't think you could really characterize that as just a nudge.
And just also, not really following up, but in the similar parallel lines, like when talking about public health, especially sanitation, or even with family planning programs, which they did use in many of the, like even in Indian context, right? The way they try to shame, or even smoking is another kind of public health. They shame and they bring a disgust as certain, emotions to make sure you keep moral policing in a way, certain bodies. Like, but it targets certain group of people here, not like everyone, right? So do you have in Ethiopia, when you were doing this, did they target certain population? Or was there a certain layers of sections in Ethiopian context? And was there certain hierarchical? You did talk about earlier on hierarchy a little bit, but could you just give us more insights towards whom did it target? Which kind of, these programs target there? And yeah.
It was rural. It was entirely rural. And I think subsequently there have been some attempts to develop this in urban contexts, but I think the state and the NGOs and the funders all recognise that it's quite a different economy of disposal, and it's not, and it's just more urgent in terms of providing urban sanitation compared to rural areas. So this was very much a rural programme, and I also think in Ethiopia in particular, there's the narrative that these kind of obedient country folk just need to be told what to do was something that was quite important in terms of developing this program. You know, that they lack capacity, they lack information, and they just need, maybe a nudge, but very shame.
Yeah. I mean, would you call it as a paternalistic approach, or just more into authoritarian way of like just dismissing and then outright, okay, you guys don't understand what it is supposed to be and how you want to live your life. So we as state, especially with certain, moral framework or even the social norm framework, which they push forward for certain programs like this. But then as you clearly pointed out with the resistance, like there is a clear resistance. You don't have a right for us to control our bodies, right? I mean, would you see it as very strong, and with certain community or with different sections, they have a very different types of resistance? How, because I remember you focused on self-disciplining with certain group, but how do you see it with the other sections?
I think, I mean, what happened was that this program did not happen as it was intended to. And there was definitely a dynamic there, which I don't know, especially as I've shortened it a lot, has come out very strongly. But, the idea that this would happen, it would kind of, the ideal of CLTS was that you would kind of set up these events, and then you would not actually order people what to do. In fact, the opposite, you weren't supposed to order people what to do. This in itself was supposed to be so shocking and triggering that it would kind of automatically lead to action. But that was something that was completely inimical to the Ethiopian governance context. And actually, there was already some similar type of program in another region of Ethiopia, and it very quickly, I mean, this was my ethnographic experience and also to some extent professional experience, and I'm quite sure it was fairly universal that it did not happen anywhere in this kind of idealized participatory way, so that you just sort of went there and left it on the table for people to act on or not, and then it very quickly became something that that you were ordered to do. And and I have talked about why, like that was, the incentives were completely contradictory for the people who were tasked with delivering it. So yeah, it was never done as it was supposed to be done, I imagine.
Okay. Now, do we have any other questions? Or even comments, or even to openly discuss further from the law, from Vania's talk to here, we can even connect and engage in the dialogue.
Just want to say you've both given me a lot to think about in terms of shame in the body and how that can be really applied by the state and systemically as well. And I know we all have to constantly check our own biases as well. And so it's very interesting to see how it's sort of, as you said, Vania, by, these medical professionals who are genuinely working very hard, believing that they're doing good things, but still what they've internalized is being enacted violently on their patients. And also how just that simple statement that the shit is good for the fields. What was called night soil in the British Empire is why we even have the grid and laneway system to begin with in our cities. And this is something that's sort of been forgotten. It sounds like in these development contexts that this was really sort of a, they didn't use the word first world at the time, but this was something that was sort of, like British Empire urban management that's really been kind of now seen for many good reasons as well, but is still, we've forgotten that human shit is still a resource as well.
Great, thank you. And just before, I don't want to lose on the comments and questions which Madeline and Linda did ask in the earlier, section for Vania. Vania, do you want to just address it quickly, and I'll also continue the discussion with Sarah, so that if anyone wants to keep thinking, questions for Sarah, I have that space.
So, okay, I'm scrolling up. I just want to make sure.
So does the Mexican medical system education follow any form of code of ethics? Like, that's the question Madeline had.
Yeah, okay, I've got to it. Yeah, definitely there's a code of ethics. In fact, all the hospitals have written guidelines pasted on most of the walls, code of like the rights of patients, the rights of nurses, the rights of staff, the rights of doctors. But like Sarah's work, it's sort of like, there's a big chasm often between ideal and practice. So yeah, I haven't gone too much into the sort of bioethics in my work, but yeah, there's codes of ethics that they're meant to follow.
Thank you.
And then I see a question by Linda Miller. Do they have communication skills teaching with simulated patients and teaching on professionalism as within the UK? They do and they don't, but it's, it isn't that often that in the hospital they have these skills teaching. There's just not much time, especially in the public hospitals. Most of the time is taken up by patient care or doing paperwork or that sort of stuff. But it's something I should look into a little bit more. I don't know the full answer to that. The second part of your question about suicide rate and rate of patient practitioner violence. Suicide rate of the physicians. Linda, I don't know if you wanted to clarify that.
Linda, do you?
Go ahead, Linda.
Sorry, my signal's really unstable. That's why I haven't got my camera on or anything like that. I think, how much compassion healthcare professionals receive has a big impact on their behaviours. 400 doctors a year in their lives in the States. I don't know about Mexico. We don't have comparative data for the UK, but it's probably similar rates.
Yeah, there's a high rate of suicide as well. Yeah, I don't know the rates.
So that just made me curious about that. And Adam Kay's book is comedy, but it's also interspersed
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it. I'm gonna check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a comment from Giskin Day about social media calling out behavior. So I guess connected to her original question to me on shaming the doctors. And I think, Linda, your final question here to me was about primary care in Mexico. Are the attitudes different there? Yeah, this primary care. The attitudes in most public hospitals towards patients kind of replicate what I've described for the obstetrics. Obstetrics often, because it's sort of, as was described by Claire Wendland, an anthropologist who's also an obstetrician, she sort of talks about, one body parting into two, right? And so you have this sort of duality of two lives going on at once. So sometimes the stakes feel higher, the aggression is higher, and then you've got that sort of gender-based violence element, which you might not have in urology or just general surgery, but mistreatment of patients is certainly the case in most types of medicine, especially when you have hierarchy and power issues.
Right. Do we have any questions for Sarah? The final thought.
Friday afternoon.
I know,
Everyone's...
it's like a weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to give a comments on the last, like wrapping up with shaming practices in public health campaign, most of the policymakers think it's something very effective. Like especially, what do you have? I mean, do you have any thoughts, or what is your comments on that? Like using shame practices or discussed as a way of public health issues.
I wasn't surprised, and I was quite what's the word? Maybe relieved to read today that really CLTS has become subsumed into other. Someone made a comment, they'll find a way, and there's long legacies, and it will continue, and I'm sure that's true. But at the same time, the responsiveness to unease about it, and I guess to evidence reviews that are finding it's not working. I mean, maybe this will be quite a short-lived episode. And I think I want to also say on the record that, it's not, when I started working on this research, some of the people I talked to were ex-colleagues, professional colleagues, and they really, one guy told me very angrily, a plane load of children in Ethiopia die every day from water and sanitation related diseases. And if the research you're doing does not contribute to improving that, then you're guilty. I mean, it was a bit strong, but it's not that I don't see the importance of improving sanitation. I just want to state that very clearly. It's just that these kind of methods, I also don't think that there's no place for shaming in public health. I don't. I think it could be a valuable tool. And I think, the example of smoking that you gave, I mean, I'm old enough to remember in the UK that we all smoked inside, and now that seems like absolute madness. You can't believe that used to happen. And I think a lot of that probably, I don't actually know the literature. I'm sure a lot of that is to do with actually effective shame-based public health messages. Yeah. And I think there are certainly ways to do it. And potentially there are ways to do it around latrines, but I think ignoring these questions of power and resources are clearly, that's not the way to do it. And that does lead to the kind of violence that I was describing, even if slightly theoretically, and that Vania is describing really, really, in quite horrific ways. But certainly there is value to shame-based public health messages. Yeah. That would be my final thing that I want to add.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Do we have any last questions? Or then, if not, then we can wrap up, right? Looks like we are almost Great. So thank you so much, Vania and Sarah, and also for all of you to actively participate. And this is really rich discussion and lots, as many of them have commented, food for thought, and we need to think through many lenses, of course. Thank you so much. Yes, the recording will be sent to all of you, and also the recording will be available on the website on Shame and Medicine Project. And we have also, we do put it on YouTube too, so anyone can get access to that. Perfect. Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Vania.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.